Hello and welcome to the Cycling Podcast. My name is Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Birnie.
Hello, Richard.
And Daniel Friebe.
Hello, Lionel. Richie.
Oh, wonderful. Here we are then, back in our natural habitat of the National Theatre. Last time we'll be here for a while, I think. And we've got lots to talk about today. We're going to talk about three different things, essentially, in three different parts. First up being Chris Froome and the controversy over the weekend of his TUE, Therapeutic Use Exemption certificate that was issued for the Tour of Romandy, which he won. Part two, we will talk about the Critérium du Dauphiné, which Froome did not win, having looked to be in a position to win. It was won in the end by Andrew Talansky of Garmin-Sharp. And in part three, we're going to talk about some general Tour de France selection issues and also the news that Belkin are withdrawing from sponsorship at the end of this year, leaving the Dutch team, formerly Rabobank, high and dry and looking for a new sponsor quite urgently, I would imagine. So let's crack on.
The Cycling Podcast. Interviews and analysis. We've got the big talking points covered.
So Chris Froome and the in inverted commas doping controversy. At the weekend, Le Journal de Dimanche on Sunday newspaper obviously, published a story that, well, the headline was certainly attention grabbing. It said that Chris Froome had doped with the assistance essentially of the UCI, been doped by the UCI. The story being that cast your minds back to the end of April and Chris Froome was down to ride Liège-Bastogne-Liège. He's had a difficult season, missing quite a few races with injury and illness and problems with his back. He's not had the sort of volume of racing that he had in 2013. He won the Tour of Oman, but since then he was a bit sort of stop and start his season. Liège-Bastogne-Liège was a big target for him. He withdrew from that, having succumbed to I think chest infection. It was reported overnight on the Saturday night. But Romandy started a couple of days later, and there was a question over whether he would start or not. He didn't recover, having pulled out Liège-Bastogne-Liège. He didn't appear to be making a full recovery for Tour de Romandy, and the Team Sky, Dr. Alan Farrell, who we have interviewed on the podcast before, requested a TUE, a therapeutic use exemption for a corticosteroid for treatment for the full week to clear up Froome's problem. And there were some questions in the article at the weekend over whether he had been given special treatment, essentially. And the UCI responded later and have reiterated since that he did not receive special treatment. And I suppose that is a decent starting point. And I think you've got some information on this, Lionel.
Well, first of all, it should be pointed out that the World Anti-Doping Agency has clarified that they are satisfied with the way the UCI handled with issuing the therapeutic use exemption form, which permitted Chris Froome to use that substance for that period of time. But the UCI sent an email a couple of hours ago saying basically that the essential point to remember in this case is that any other rider in the same situation with comparable supporting medical evidence would have been given an authorisation to take similar oral treatment. I think the UCI are at pains to try and stress that they haven't, for any reason, they haven't given Chris Froome or Team Sky any kind of preferential treatment, and that this process goes on all of the time. We don't get access to the number of TUEs that are issued. We don't know what they're issued for, and I think there are very good reasons for not making the whole business of therapeutic use exemption public, because we're talking about a kind of medical confidentiality here. Everybody has a right to some medical privacy. Just because they're an athlete, should we know exactly what they are being prescribed at any given time? There is an argument to say that perhaps we should, for the Tour de France. We should know that of 198 riders, 72 or whatever, and I'm plucking that number completely out of the air. Don't get the impression that 72 out of 198 riders are typically on TUEs at the Tour de France, but we don't have enough information about the general use of TUEs to form a really informed opinion about how this case has kind of come to light. All we know is that Chris Froome, the defending Tour de France champion, has used a TUE, and all of the talk about Chris Froome's last year at the Tour de France, he was asked in a press conference whether he'd had a TUE for that Tour de France, and he said no. So I think the impression is that he's not ever had one, and that may not be the case.
Well, I mean, there was an interesting quote. It only appeared in the Times newspaper, and I don't think a lot of people saw it because of the paywall with the Times, but he did say that he's not had a TUE in 6.5 years, which basically covers his entire pro career, which is probably quite unusual. Now, I suppose the other question, though, is should somebody be racing if their health is that bad, and if they need that kind of drug to get through the race? Should they even be racing?
I mean, Rich, this is something that I really struggle with this particular substance, because it's not as though, we talked about this yesterday, Rich, it's not as though the pathology itself, which in this case was some kind of chest infection, that neuters the performance-enhancing effects of the drug. The performance-enhancing effects in this case are side effects. It's not like having a TUE. Let's say, in theory, you could get a TUE for EPO because you were severely anemic. The EPO would then address the pathology without giving you an additional performance boost. That's not the case here. Just because Chris Froome was ill, it doesn't mean that the drug didn't have performance enhancing effects. So I just don't, I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, but that's my understanding, and I just don't know how that can be justifiable.
The thing is that it is justifiable and permitted under the wider code. So the thing that is up for scrutiny here is the wider code, which gets reviewed on an annual basis. A new code will be out in 2015, and I think you're absolutely right though, on the basis of the issuing of TUEs, and I cast my mind back to the Dauphiné in 2011. I've talked about this before on the podcast, so I'll keep it brief, but basically Rigoberto Urán, who was riding for Sky at the time, had some kind of chest infection, chest problem, desperate to finish the race to try and secure his place in the Tour de France team for Sky, knowing that what an important race that is for to earn selection for the Tour, and Sky's doctor on that race, Dr. Richard Freeman, he made a request to the race doctor to get a medical treatment prescribed for Rigoberto Urán. The race doctor agreed, and then Dr. Freeman, once he had the agreement of the race doctor to apply for the TUE, he then contacted the UCI, and it would have been Dr. Mario Zorzoli of the UCI who then granted the request. Urán finished the race, and I put it to Richard Freeman at that time, if he is unwell, if he's got breathing problems that are preventing him riding through the Alps in the Dauphiné, surely the most logical thing is for the rider to pull out. And Dr. Freeman said, basically, that may very well happen. That may very well be the most sensible course of action for Rigoberto Urán in this case. However, being a professional athlete, he wants to carry on with the race. He wants to push himself as hard as possible to complete the race. And it's permitted within the rules to apply for a TUE. So where do if there is a provision within the rules for these medications to be prescribed, do you say, well, it needs a complete revision of the wider code? Otherwise, we can't just, we have to leave it up to WADA, surely, to decide what should be allowed and what shouldn't. And in this case, the Chris Froome case, it's been allowed, no?
I mean, we should in theory, but in reality, everyone has their own parameters. Everyone dictates their own rules on this. I mean, if you talk to someone like Christophe Basson, who famously Mr. Clean of the 1990s, he is firmly against the idea of any TUEs and says that a bike race is also a test of health, and the healthiest athlete, that's also part of who's going to win is the athlete that manages to stay healthy enough. And you look at subgroupings now within the professional peloton, the MPCCC, the Movement pour Cyclisme Crédible, they have their own rules with they don't permit corticoids, or you have to observe a period of 8 days of rest. So in reality, everyone is drawing the line at the moment where they see fit within the boundaries of that wider code.
Yeah, there's no sort of black or white. There is this grey area, and TUEs do kind of fall squarely into that grey area. I think it became a bit of a talking point during the Tour last year, and Froome did divulge that he didn't have any TUEs. The Team Sky Dr. Alan Farrell divulged that nobody on the squad at that time had any TUEs. an irony to this particular story, perhaps, is that that Sky have been dogged by a lot of illnesses and problems with riders this year, and injuries and so on. And there was a whisper going around that this was part of the problem, was that Sky were being very, very conservative in allowing their riders to be treated for ailments and illnesses, and were proving very reluctant to apply for TUEs. So it's kind of ironic that this has come back to bite them. I can only think that in the case of Froome, there was this concern that he was behind in his racing, and that he really hasn't had the level of regular tough racing this year that they think is necessary for him to defend his Tour de France title, and that by Romandy it was a sort of desperate measure in a way. He's not helped by the fact that he won that race in very impressive and dominant fashion. The other thing we've not mentioned, which does provide a little bit of context to this, is the use of an inhaler at the Dauphiné. He was caught on French TV using a perfectly legal inhaler. This led to a revelation to a lot of people that he is asthmatic and has been since childhood. Clearly he didn't feel that using an inhaler, that there was anything, there shouldn't be a stigma around that. He was at the front of the bunch in a yellow jersey, fairly visible. And again, like the TUE case, he's not done anything at all out with the rules here. But these little episodes add together. It also should add as well that his book has just come out, which 400 odd pages of his life story, which doesn't mention that he's been asthmatic since childhood. Now, if he's lived with that all his life, he perhaps doesn't feel that it's all that noteworthy. And I'm not sure that I would read too much into that. I don't think there's a deliberate attempt to disguise the fact that he's asthmatic. Why would he? He's dyslexic as well, and that's mentioned very, very briefly in the book. There's one reference to it. So I think you could say that Froome is, the suspicion that's sort of dogging him. Each of these sort of pieces of evidence that's cited against him, if you like, each of them can be explained away, but the accumulation of all this stuff adds up to some kind of imaginary case against him. The best thing that's happened to him, perhaps, is to lose the Dauphiné. He crashed a couple of days to go in the Dauphiné, having won the first two stages and looked like he was going to dominate there as well. He did seem to suffer as a result of his crash, and eventually fell away quite dramatically on the final day. If he had won that in dominant fashion, that white noise around him could be quite deafening by now.
Yeah, I think the inhaler thing was certainly something that, for the casual observer of cycling, cycling is famously the toughest endurance sport on the planet, isn't it? Or it's billed as such, and for an asthmatic to be winning races, it kind of, for the general public to get their hands around that, get their heads around that, that's quite a leap, isn't it? And so the argument about using an inhaler at the front of the bunch in the yellow jersey, in a way, it brought it to the fore. He's not trying to hide anything there, clearly. But as you say, he hasn't mentioned that he suffers from asthma. Given that he's just published a book that told the story of his life. But thinking of another book, Inside Team Sky, I think this is another thing where people are kind of joining the dots together to try and present a case against Team Sky. In that book, Inside Team Sky, by David Walsh, there's a quote in which Dr. Steve Peters, who was their head of medical, said that the team had a policy that they would never apply for TUEs for breathing difficulties, asthma, that kind of thing. And of course, as I've just explained, they have done that on one notable occasion, and that probably wouldn't be in the public domain had I not actually been there in the hotel at the Dauphiné when Rigoberto Urán had a problem. We don't know, because none of this business of TUEs is disclosed. So because something has come up, it's being, something is being extrapolated from these two events, and as you say, a kind of a jigsaw is being pieced together effectively on the eve of the Tour de France.
Of course, as you said earlier, Lionel, TUEs are meant to be confidential, and there is a good reason for that. And I'm kind of uncomfortable with riders being almost forced or bullied in some cases into divulging whether they're using TUEs or not, because there could be perfectly legitimate and understandable reasons for not wanting to disclose that you're on medication for some ailment or other. So it does set an unfortunate precedent, perhaps, but maybe the sport, this sort of level of distrust in the sport is such that we have to, not in not many professions are you required to give regular blood and urine samples either. Maybe it's just another sacrifice, if you like, thing that professional athletes have to commit to.
So perhaps the answer is disclose every TUE, and if we get to the Tour de France and at some point you see the list and one rider's on 11 medicines, I mean, people would draw a conclusion from that, wouldn't they?
They would, and again, that athlete may not be breaking any rules, breaking any sporting rules. I mean, the other thing is how did the Froome's TUE come into the public domain? I mean, that, who leaked it and why? And these stories often come on the eve of the Tour de France. So this came just a few days after the inhaler.
I hope it wasn't Bradley Wiggins. That's a rather scurrilous allegation. I'm sure it wasn't. Absolutely 100% sure it wasn't.
You were going to make a serious point, Daniel.
I was going to make a serious point. Just leaving the issue of TUEs to one side and just talking more generally about cortisone. Now, cortisone is a drug that was very prevalent, I think, at first in the 70s in professional cycling. Bernard Thévenet, the 1975 and 77 Tour winner, was the first person to really confess that he'd been a big user of it, and he subsequently suffered a big from adrenal fatigue, and he basically had to take a year off cycling because the damage that cortisone had done. But I think cortisone has really come back to the fore since the UCI and other authorities have clamped down on EPO. It's often seen as light doping, but in actual fact I think it's pretty potent. But one of the big problems with cortisone is that in 2005, when the UCI adopted the WADA code, they basically adopted a threshold. Previously, any trace of cortisone in urine would have shown up as an adverse finding. Now there's a threshold of about 30 nanograms. It's 30 nanograms, and up to that threshold, you can take whatever you like. Now, if you take something like prednisone, which is what Chris Froome took, albeit with a therapeutic use exemption, you will probably go above 30 nanograms. However, there is another...
He was on 40.
He was on 40. However, there is another very common kind of corticosteroid called triamcinolone. Now, this is what was found in Lance Armstrong's urine in 1999 at the Tour de France. Now, this is a progressive release corticoid, and you will pretty much, I'm told by doctors and anti-doping experts, you will pretty much always be below the threshold if you take fairly large doses of that, because the substance is released progressively, and it can have an effect for weeks, including performance-enhancing effect for weeks, yet you will never show up positive in a doping test. And I think that's just one of the issues with cortisone. As I said before, there are issues in terms of conformity between the MPCCC and the UCI. Some teams have different rules to others, so I think it is a bit of a hornet's nest.
Prednisolone, I believe you've had a recent experience of this as well, Daniel, haven't you?
I didn't win any major tours or even one-day races or even jogs around the park. No, it's a pretty hefty substance in terms of side effects. Can induce mood swings. I don't know if you remember.
We
3 or 4
noticed.
weeks ago. And high blood pressure, and it's certainly not like taking a Lemsip or a paracetamol. You can certainly feel that it's a lot more heavy duty than that.
So would Sky have been better advised not to have applied for the TUE and not to have sought to medicate Chris Froome through his period of illness, which coincided with one of his major races in the build-up to the Tour?
I think certainly, with hindsight, they would have been better advised to withdraw him from the race. Their argument would be that the TUE should never have been made public. I'm not aware of TUEs ever actually being made public like this, and a story being generated out of an athlete's TUE. But their argument, I guess, would have been, well, would he have been conditioned to win the Tour if he didn't have that race in his legs? And that's the unknowable, I suppose. As I say, the discomfort comes not so much in the fact that he was on the medication, but that won the race in such dominant fashion when he was clearly below par and ill. And that knowing what we know now about the medication that he was on, that does leave you feeling slightly uncomfortable, I think.
Do you think the other issue here is that the narrative of this story, the way it's unfolded, people hear and see the parallels between the era of complicity from the UCI, where Lance Armstrong was given a backdated TUE to explain use of cortisone, as you explained there, Daniel, and the suspicion from the article that was published on Sunday in the French newspaper is that Sky somehow had they had a favour given to them, which WADA has kind of looked into that and has said that's not the case. But nevertheless, the newspaper article saw fit to mention that Brian Cookson, who is the president of the UCI, his son Oliver works for Team Sky, and so there's, like I said before, there's this kind of jigsawing, and people have asked us on Twitter, should we be concerned about this link? Is Oliver Cookson somehow Sky's kind of immunity card when it comes to the UCI's anti-doping rules? And I have to say, having looked at the conflict of interest that previously existed with Pat McQuaid, the last UCI president, and his son Andrew being quite a prominent rider's agent, and asked questions about that, and the McQuaid's, or Pat McQuaid, is many things, but certainly the answers he gave about the way that he would not be able to influence anti-doping proceedings during his presidency, it did give quite a reassuring explanation of the protocols that were in place to prevent Andrew McQuaid having any influence if, for example, a rider that he represented had failed a dope test. The suspicion was, that would then be covered up, because the UCI, there's been such suspicion about the way that it operates, and I'm sure that is why people have looked at Oliver Cookson's role at Team Sky, which is, he's part of the logistics staff.
Should Ollie Cookson, who's been in post since before his father was made president, he's not got that job because his father is president of the UCI. He did get the job while his father was president of British Cycling. Should he lose his job as a result of his father becoming president of UCI?
Well, I don't think you can say. I mean, you can't say that somebody can't work in cycling because their father is an elected president of the governing body. Oliver Cookson got that job with Team Sky. He had worked as a kind of a ride guide for Sky's corporate staff going on cycling events in Mallorca and other places. And he's a cyclist himself. He was living in Spain, in Madrid, working as a landscape architect. He lost his job in the recession, as the recession hit Spain first, and he did some freelance work in logistics, because he has good language skills. He speaks fluent Spanish, he speaks Italian, and it was during the Vuelta in 2010, which of course was horrendous for Team Sky, because one of their soigneurs, Chema Gonzalez, died of septicemia, I think it was, during that race. And of course Sky had to deal with all of the fallout of that, had to be involved with the hospitals and notifying the family, and Oliver, with his Spanish understanding of how Spain worked, he was an incredibly useful person to have on the team at that during that terrible time. And I gather that when Dave Brailsford or Sky wanted to offer Oliver a more permanent role with the team, Dave Brailsford rang Brian Cookson and said, look, would it be embarrassing to you if I offered him a job, if we offered him a job? And at that point, Brian Cookson was president of British Cycling. He was on the board of the company, the service company, which monitored the relationship between British Cycling and Team Sky, and he offered to resign from that in case there was any conflict of interest. And I think conflict of interest is something that everybody needs to be aware of, but if there are processes and protocols in place to prevent improper and inappropriate relationships being formed, then you have to kind of acknowledge the conflict of interest and keep an eye on it, but move on. I think the question of should Oliver Cookson be barred from working in cycling, I think that is taking it too far. And to see the link in the newspaper, it's another attempt at kind of jigsawing together a case against Sky, I think. And
playing devil's advocate for a moment, Sky do make some, I think, odd decisions, and Ollie Cookson is the link between the Spanish and the Colombian riders in the team. They've got a big contingent now of Spaniards and Colombians, and so it made perfect logical sense for him to return to Colombia with Sergio Henao when he was under investigation, in inverted commas, for anomalies in his blood values. Again, the perception was there that he was sort of being investigated for possible doping, which he in essence he was. The obvious person to go with him back to Colombia to keep him company and to monitor him was Ollie Cookson. But was that not a case of, again, giving people ammunition to say, well, there's a rider under investigation for doping. There's a son of the UCI president with him. He also happens to be an employee of Team Sky. He wasn't under investigation by the UCI, but nevertheless, there could be a perception there. So it's not always about necessarily doing the logical or the right thing. It's also about how things are perceived as well.
Well, there certainly is a perception of that, and people will put all of these things together and come to the conclusion that there's something afoot. And you're absolutely right. But what is the alternative course of action for them? They will maintain that they've done nothing wrong, that they have acted in accordance with the rules. All we can kind of do is, as I say, kind of keep an eye on how these things develop. I mean, I'm loath to kind of belittle Ollie Cookson's role within Team Sky, but from what I've seen of how he works, incredibly hard, because those roles are very demanding. But he is part of the logistics team. He's out on the road, or he's not. Personally, he's not involved in performance, and personally, I think it's too much of a stretch to suggest that he's got some kind of bat phone to Brian Cookson, UCI president. He can call up and say, "Hey, Dad, can we fix this problem?" I could be completely wrong, but I don't read it that way. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think just a final point I'd make is that Sky are learning the hard way, and this is their 5th season now, that about the responsibility incumbent on a team that has a Tour de France winner, or a team that is seen as the best, most prestigious or richest or whatever in the sport. And you do have to be whiter than white. You have to go the extra mile. You have to go further than other teams. You have to anticipate this kind of story, this kind of negative publicity, and you have to, and maybe they should have put out a press release as soon as they knew that Chris Froome was going to be on this legitimate TUE at Romandy. Maybe they should have preempted the speculation that's come about since then. And they've been lucky in one respect that this story has broken 3 weeks before the Tour de France in usual circumstances, and I don't know whether the newspaper in question sensed that this story was going to break somewhere else, or that maybe the UCI were going to disclose details about it. But usually in those circumstances, a newspaper would have saved this story for the first weekend of the Tour to make a bigger splash and cause even more problems for Team Sky. They didn't do that, which I think, and Sky have had a warning which could be very valuable for them, because they can now go away for 3 weeks and they've got an idea of what's coming their way.
So if you were Dave Brailsford then, Richard, would you, as Daniel suggests, preempt all of this, and would you be the first team to disclose its riders' TUEs on the eve of the Tour de France?
Well, they did it last year when we asked whether any of the squad were on TUEs, and they said no. Alan Farrell, in an interview with the podcast, said no one on the team had a TUE during the Tour last year. I would. Daniel's absolutely right. Right from year one, they've kind of been on the back foot with this. Brailsford's priority is performance. Whereas a team like Garmin-Sharp, for example, was set up with a sort of different raison d'etre. It wasn't actually a team that was set up to win the Tour de France. It was a team that was set up to try and change the culture of cycling and to be whiter than white and to be super clean and super transparent. They haven't always lived up to those standards they've set themselves, and as we've discovered over recent months and years, there's an awful lot of the riders on that team with sketchy histories, but nevertheless they are sort of seen as paragons, as the team that really sets the standard for other teams, and Sky are not seen as the team that sets the standard for other teams. Whether they are or not, they're just not seen as being that team, and I think the only way to achieve that is a level of transparency that the sport has never seen before.
This is the Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Birnie and Daniel Friebe.
Okay, let's talk about some bike racing then. The Criterium du Dauphiné, which finished at the weekend and was won by Andrew Talansky, young American rider with Garmin-Sharp. Fantastic race. I think after 2 stages we thought it was going to be the Chris Froome show. He won the first 2 stages, but he crashed in the leader's jersey on the Friday with 2 days to go. And sometimes crashes do take it out of you, and I think he really did suffer the next couple of days. I think it was Neil Rogers of Velo News who sort of challenged people who were saying that a crash like that shouldn't have affected his performance so much. He said, try throwing yourself out of a car at 30 miles an hour and then see how you feel over the next couple of days. You know, in terms of sleeping, recovery and so on, they definitely do have an effect.
And one of the big reasons for that is the big shot of adrenaline you get, don't you, too? The body will produce, which starts the healing process of, you know, if you've broken skin, and it often leaves you kind of depleted 2 or 3 days later. It's
actually quite rare that a Tour de France winner has crashed heavily in the Tour. It often does actually do for riders in some way, shape or form. It's quite, you know, you always see big crashes in the first week of the Tour, but I'm struggling to remember a Tour winner on the Champs-Élysées with sort of crash wounds. Certainly Armstrong, I don't know if we still count him as a Tour winner. He crashed only in one Tour, didn't he, in 2003. Anyway, it was a fantastic race. Let's not take away from Talansky, who rode a brilliant tactical race. And again, we saw some really aggressive racing from Garmin-Sharp, a little bit like in the Tour last year on that second day in the Pyrenees that we talk about a lot. They gambled everything on getting a big result, and they got it on Sunday. A big early break went, included a few guys in the top 10, including Talansky, young Adam Yates, who finished 6th overall and having an incredible season, perhaps the best debut season since Peter Sagan a few years ago. A different kind of rider, obviously, more like sort of Stephen Roach in the 80s, although he won quite a few races. But to see that sort of stage racing talent emerge in such a young rider is very, very unusual. So it was a fantastic race in the end, and it really whets the appetite for the Tour, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does. I thought, you know, the Dauphiné I've always enjoyed. It's just the start of the Tour de France for me, and I think this year's race benefited hugely from not having a big time trial in the middle, which it has had the last number of years, because it meant that everything had to be decided on the hillier stages and the mountainous stages. And hats off to Garmin-Sharp. I saw on Twitter Jonathan Vaughters congratulating Geert van Bont, their Belgian director sportif, for coming up with the tactical plan of getting Talansky in that early break, or early-ish break. Really aggressive, smart, clever riding. One of the most enjoyable couple of hours of watching bike racing, not just this year, but for the last number of years.
I mean, what was great was Contador and Froome were left behind, sort of looking at each other. The tactics worked excellently, partly because Contador was in yellow, but with a pretty weak team, certainly the B or the C team of Tinkoff Saxo. He'll have a much stronger team at the Tour, that's for sure. But it did leave the responsibility with Tinkoff Saxo. They weren't really able. It was such a big break with so many teams represented. It was hard to really make inroads. And by the time Sky took it on, it was a little bit too late. They were also a bit hamstrung by the fact that Froome was clearly not at his best. It took Contador a while to really seize the initiative, and eventually he took off. And his ride through the break and through some of the remnants of the break was very, very impressive. But actually, Talansky deserved it. I mean, he didn't get a free ride to the finish. He owed a lot to rider Hesjedal, who did a power of work on the front. But Talansky actually went up that final climb quicker than Contador. Now, he was in a group, but he was leading that group for a lot of the way. So it was a thoroughly deserved victory. It wasn't a lucky win by any means.
No, and he didn't get a huge amount of help. He got some help from Jürgen van den Broek, who himself was aiming for a high finish on GC on that last climb. But what really impressed me about Talansky was the way he managed to stay cool, perhaps unlike certain times in the past. The 2013 Paris-Nice springs to mind, where he obviously was feeling very good, and he tried to attack Richie Porte at the end of in the final kilometre of the Montagne de Lourdes stage, and really was impetuous, went too hard, too soon, and probably, certainly cost himself a good chance of winning that race. On Sunday, he managed to stay calm, kept an even pace, knew that Contador was coming up behind, but didn't lose his head. and on the basis of the Dauphiné, he looks like he might be about the third or fourth strongest rider in the Tour field on current form. Nibali wasn't particularly impressive. The one thing in Nibali's favour, well, two things. One, 2012 Dauphiné was a very similar performance, or probably a worse performance, in fact, and he recovered to go well in the Tour that year. And also, with Nibali, one thing you can bank on is his courage, his panache, and we saw that on Sunday. He wasn't content just to roll in and take third or fourth place overall. He went for broke, and it didn't come off, but he will do that again in the Tour. And with Contador, who will ride in a very similar style, I think that represents the biggest danger to Froome, their ability to invent things, to improvise, to attack when Sky don't expect it. And we've seen so many times before that Sky are not particularly good under those conditions, and they sort of capitulated again on Sunday, albeit, as you say, Rich, that was partly explained by Froome's difficulties on the day.
And perception, we're talking about perception a lot in the first section, but in a different context, perception is so important. And Sky have maybe lost that aura that they had in 2012, certainly, where they were dominant all season, especially at the Dauphiné and the Tour, and also at the Dauphiné in 2013, actually. The aura started to crack a little bit at the Tour last year, but I think now we saw on Sunday in the Dauphiné, teams are not afraid to really take them on, and it was interesting. Sky placed 3 riders in that break, and Mikel Nieve won the stage, which was a nice consolation prize for them, I suppose. But the idea that Sky are going to have it all their way and be able to control the race, we saw it as well at the start of the 2013 Tour. That first day in the Mountain Tax Trois Domaines, Sky ripped it to pieces because they believed that they could. And the question, I suppose, going into the Tour is, will that belief still be there? I'm really not sure it will be.
I also just wonder whether it has proven more difficult for them in a perverse kind of way to ride for Chris Froome than it was to ride for Bradley Wiggins, in the sense that with Bradley Wiggins you knew that he was limited. They've always known that he was quite limited in terms of following accelerations. There was really only ever one way to ride Bradley Wiggins, which was pretty much a team time trial all the way through a mountain stage, and leave him exposed, hopefully only for the last 3 or 4 kilometres on a summit finish. Whereas now with Froome has a lot more in his locker in terms of being able to attack in the mountains. It opens up more scenarios to them, but that also perhaps complicates things at times, because they don't have a large number of riders that can go with him, that can follow him, that can sort of lead him out before those attacks.
If, as we anticipate, the Tour is between Alberto Contador and Chris Froome, I think the thing that most excited me was that some of the other teams aren't going to just follow along in their wake and just allow those two and their teams to have everything all their own way. Hopefully Nibali will come round and will be better, and he'll have a strong team behind him. I think, of the freelancers, if you like, Talansky and Jürgen Vandenbroek look like the most likely. They're going to be there in the front group in the mountains. And again, it's going to be about who has the tactical nous, hopefully, rather than just thinking that you can crack Froome and Contador and Saxa, Tinkoff and Sky just by grinding them down. That isn't going to happen. The only way to kind of try and counteract their strength and strength in numbers is by this kind of creative thinking and picking the days very carefully and putting together a tactical plan. And I think that's why Sunday's stage in the Dauphiné was fantastic to watch, because the best days of bike racing are when you're struggling to kind of work out what is happening while it's happening, and then it all kind of makes sense when you see the GC at the end of the stage.
And in terms of that improvisation, Lionel, the sort of possibility of Contador or Nibali kind of springing an ambush at some point, you look at those 3 days, particularly 2 of the days in the Vosges Mountains at the end of the first week, and okay, that comes before the Alps and it comes to the Pyrenees. It's perhaps a little bit early in the race. No one will be desperate at that point. However, that is very sort of fertile terrain for that kind of racing.
You're listening to the Cycling Podcast. Tweet us at cycling_podcast.
Part 3, fellas, we're going to talk a little bit about Tour de France selection, speculation, and also we're going to talk a little bit about the demise of the Belkin team. Belkin have announced today that they are pulling out of sponsoring the Dutch team at the end of this year. They only came into the sport on the eve of the Tour last year. Daniel and I had a bit of a heated debate before this podcast about this. He feels quite strongly that some of the anger directed at Belkin is misplaced. I understand the anger felt by fans in a way. Anger is maybe a bit strong, but certainly disappointment, because I think there's a dearth of proper sponsors backing big teams. An awful lot of the teams are very reliant on a wealthy individual or a consortium of wealthy individuals. There are very few teams in the sport that seem to be in it as marketing, as part of their marketing programs, which is what the sport kind of depends upon, strange as it sounds. It's not a good sign, is it, that a big company like that is cutting and running so soon after getting involved?
No, but maybe they've got out of cycling what they came in for. They stepped in to change, to rescue really the old Rabobank team, which let's not forget had lost one of the big blue chip companies that was associated with cycling, Rabobank, one of the biggest banks in the world. You kind of used the successive doping scandals and as a reason to pull out of cycling ahead of the end of their contract. Then the team was called Blanco for a while, when it was basically a billboard. They could have ridden around with the Dutch equivalent of your company's name here on the front of their jerseys. And then Belkin stepped in, and I must confess, and this is probably, people will correct me here, but Belkin, it was always a strange fit to me. They seem to be a bit, they do what? iPhone gadgets and cases and stuff. Is that right? Is that what they make?
Yeah, information technology accessories.
Right. So, it's kind of like Tandy or Currys or somebody, is it, sponsoring the cycling team?
Maybe a little bit more sort of Californian cool than that, Lionel. An odd fit though with a team that had previously been so identifiably Dutch. It was almost, Rabobank were almost like the Dutch national team, weren't they? And it was strange to see them in the green and black of Belkin and sponsored by this American company.
But the point I was going to make was that I couldn't quite see how they were, and this is a phrase I only really learnt recently, but how were they activating that sponsorship? How were they bringing it alive? It wasn't like they brought out a range of Lawrence Ten Dam iPhone covers, or, do you know what I mean? There wasn't a sort of a synergy between the company and the team.
Charlie Wagelius did buy a Belkin accessory recently, purely on the basis that they sponsored a cycling team. So there you go.
Well, I mean,
that's not activation.
I mean, let's think of other cycling team sponsors, how they've activated their sponsorship. I mean, would you say Quick Step activated their laminate floor promotion with those incredibly, insufferably cheesy adverts with Richard Veronka triumphing Paolo Bettini?
Yeah, I think they did do that. I think, you see other companies kind of embracing the fact that they're sponsoring the team a little bit better. It's sad that a team and the sport as a whole has lost a sponsor that was putting in money to keep one of the biggest teams going. But at the end of the day, we're not necessarily party to what it was that Belkin were looking to get out of it. I mean, short-term exposure. Maybe they've reached a point where they've felt, well, we've got what we wanted, and we're not going to commit any further. That's perfectly fair enough. If you have a system which depends solely on title sponsorship, then this is going to happen. I know that the people that run the sport, certainly the teams, they want to change this model so that it is more secure. And I think probably for the long-term health of the sport, that would be better. But unfortunately, the law of the jungle. Another company will either come in and sponsor what will presumably revert to being the Blanco team, or they won't, and it will fold, and the riders will be looking for alternative teams.
I suppose it's the model that doesn't inspire faith. It's a bit of a busted flush, it seems, pro cycling. As long as there's no revenue from races, from TV rights, etc., then it's a very expensive sport. The returns in terms of publicity are clearly very good. You get an awful lot more exposure being the title sponsor of a pro team than you do being a shirt sponsor of a middling football club, I would have thought, for probably similar levels of investment. Belkin's official reason is that they want a more of a global strategy rather than a European focused one. You know, there are plenty of companies with a European focus. I have to say that I actually have Quick Step flooring purely on the basis of those dry humping adverts.
I don't go to B&Q. I go across the channel to Castorama if I need, a tin of paint or some screws.
I only rent Europe cars and only from the Vendée.
Did Mr. Bricolage ever have a team? I'd like to think they did. Probably a minor French Espoir team.
I bought my wife's engagement ring in Jean Delatour.
No, you didn't. I would love it if that was true. But Belkin were, bearing that in mind that they want a more international focus, they were perhaps with the wrong team. It is a very sort of Dutch-centric team. But Rich, you mentioned, I think on Twitter earlier, Bob Stapleton always used to rave about fantastic returns for cycling sponsors, but another thing that Bob Stapleton always used to say was that the real jackpot was for a company coming in just before the Tour de France, like Belkin did last year, developing their brand recognition, which I think was a big thing for Belkin, and then probably leaving fairly shortly afterwards, which is what, again, Belkin have done. Just in terms of the general outlook in Dutch cycling at the moment, Giant Shimano still really, really struggling for a sponsor next year as well. Meanwhile, there's a group comprising Michael Boogart, Jean-Paul Van Poppel, Eric Breukink, and Michael Zeilard, who is the husband of Leontien van Moorsel, and they've been working on a project for a few months now, Project Oranje, so it's the Orange Project, and they want to set up a pro-continental team solely of Dutch riders, and they're only looking for around 3 million euros in budget, so if any listeners are feeling flush at the moment, then you know who to contact. But it is conceivable that new team could be the only elite Dutch professional team next year. I think that's probably unlikely, because there is scope there for someone to come in and sweep up the best talent from Giant Shimano. And
sorry, can I just say, just talking about the way that the sport's structured and how teams are dependent on their sponsors, and when the contracts run out and the sponsor says we're not interested anymore, the teams are kind of back to square one. Everyone's been talking over the last number of years, in fact more years than I care to remember, about changing the model of professional cycling. It does strike me that it is within the hands of the powerful teams to suggest an alternative model where they could basically have a kind of revenue share of sponsorship. They could pay all of the net sponsorship into a central fund, which would then offer a kind of insurance policy against a sponsor pulling out, and would then perhaps buy one extra year in which the team would be able to continue. But whether you would get the powerful teams to contribute to that kind of fund, because it would probably cost each team €500,000 or so to contribute to that. I mean, but it is within their power with the current system to provide a safety net that benefits everybody. But I can't really see that working any better than the system we currently have.
Self-interest rules the day, I think. I'm not sure that would work. The only model with legs, I think, is something that gives the teams a share of the income from races, from TV rights. Really, that means the Tour de France. The ASO and the Tour hold all the cards here, and why would they voluntarily let them go? This was another argument that Daniel and I had before the podcast. If all the top teams decided to boycott the Tour one year, Daniel insists that wouldn't actually matter. I think it would.
I think it would matter, but I think the Tour would ultimately survive. I mean, as Prudy is always telling us, le Tour, c'est le Tour.
Oui, c'est vrai, but nevertheless, I think that the teams, someone would buckle, someone would, Francis de Jeux would suddenly look at winning the Tour with Thibaut Pinot or something, and they would. It would be a sort of game of chicken, and one team would pull out of the agreement and say they'll ride.
Oh, it'd be wonderful. It'd be like the miners' strike or something. Not that the miners' strike was wonderful, but there'd be sort of there'd be boycotts and there'd be scabs and there'd be a real.
Brian Cookson as Mrs. Thatcher, Christian Prudhomme, Arthur Scargill. No, sorry, Mark Madio or somebody as Arthur Scargill. What would Christian Prudhomme be?
Lionel is more familiar with the
politics,
yeah.
Christian Prudhomme would probably be Ken Livingstone, the leader of the GLC at the time in the 80s. He had very little to do with the miners' strike, but was still a prominent political figure at the time.
Prudhomme would be Margaret Thatcher. What am I talking about?
Yeah. The Iron Lady.
Yeah, the Iron Lady. Yeah. Anyway,
we get back to more serious
moving on.
matters.
I mean, Belkin, though, there was when they came along as sponsor on the eve of the Tour in 2013, there was echoes of Columbia, which Bob Stapleton produced as a sponsor, and then HTC. Both of those sponsorships announced on the eve of the Tour. Also, Garmin were announced on the eve of the 2008 Tour, weren't they? All that way back. They're still in the sport. And also, a bit like HTC and Columbia, I think they picked it up for a bargain price because the Rabobank money was carrying on. Here's a left field suggestion: Rabobank come back. As the sport repaired itself, can they have what they have now is a very promising, talented young team. Wilco Kelderman has followed up a great ride at the Giro with 4th overall and the best young riders jersey at the Dauphiné. He looks a real find. He's still only 23, only just turned 23 as well. So there's a potential podium finisher for the Dutch at the Tour de France.
Is that this week's exclusive news? Rabobank are coming back. Definitely happening.
Richard's rumours. No, absolutely not. No, it's not. And that's just left field. That's a bit like my suggestion that Quintana will ride the Tour. Although that's maybe based on slightly more intelligence.
Oh, really? Kelderman's going to Orica Green Edge.
When I say slightly more intelligence, I mean maybe a tweet or something.
Oh, really?
Kelderman's going to Orica Green Edge, yeah.
If that team doesn't survive, I think, if Belkin don't survive, I think that's where he will end up. Are we going to talk about some team news for the Tour?
Yeah, let's do it.
Quick run through. It wouldn't be a cycling podcast without mentioning the travails of Pippo Pozzato. See, the prognosis isn't looking good. Obviously, there's the prospect of the much trumpeted Pippo special at the Tour de France. We were going to do a live podcast with Pippo, possibly on the Lamprey bus, if he's allowed on the Lamprey bus. But I understand that he'll need a very, very good performance in the Tour of Slovenia, which I think starts tomorrow, and then possibly the Italian National Championships to make the team. There's a lot of competition there with Horner and Rui Costa and Sasha Modelo as well. What did you chaps make of Boonen not being picked for the Omega Pharma Quick Step team? Surprised?
Not terribly surprised in the end, but I thought they might pick him just because of the cobbled stage, a chance to win that, possibly even get into the yellow jersey on a day like that if he was able to get over the climbs in Yorkshire. It's a shame, a big name, but we haven't really seen Boonen at his best in the Tour for 5-6 years almost.
Doesn't like the Tour, does he, really? Doesn't like the Tour, so I wonder if he's quite happy with that decision, but I think it is a shame, yeah.
And Betancourt is definitely going to be out of the AG2R team, so that's another shame. And Giant Shimano announced last week that Warren Barguil will not make his debut in the Tour de France, which, in light of what we just said about them looking for a sponsor, I mean, their search is probably not focused in France, but there's obviously been a lot of publicity surrounding Barguil and even talk of him being a future Tour de France winner. I don't necessarily subscribe to that idea, but he will not ride the Tour and he will ride the Vuelta. We'll have to console ourselves with Romain Bardet and Thibaut Pinot.
I'm sure that'll be enough for you, Daniel. You'll have your hands full with those two. So let's wrap up because it's been a long one this week. We're going to be back next week with our New Look podcast, a one-off special, a David Miller special. We sat down recently with David and had a long conversation with him on various topics, so it'll be a David Miller special. It'll also launch our new podcast, which more details will emerge in the next week, and we'll obviously trumpet that when it is broadcast next week. We will remind you as well that during the Tour de France we'll be doing a daily podcast. We'll also have a preview podcast, and more details to emerge in the next week about all that. But Lionel, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Rich. I'm just going down browsing my list of Lionel Richie songs, which I usually do at some point in the podcast. He released a song called Climbing, that'd be very useful for the Tour, wouldn't it?
We've got to play that for the mountain stages, haven't we, at the Tour?
The Cycling Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes, listen on Audioboo, and visit us at thecyclingpodcast.com.